Now, the sword might not look so strange from within its sheath, but yeah. Now, I got this blade a long while back. I'd say roughly about 7 to 8 years, possibly. Right around the time StrongBlade started advertising their new line of functional high carbon steel tempered weapons. Now, most of them were anywhere at the time roughly $80 to $200, and if I'm correct, they still sell them for around those budgetable prices. And at the time that I found this sword online, I was looking for something within my budget and something that would match my aesthetic for my Teutonic ensemble, and this happened to fit that perfectly. Unfortunately, I overlooked a lot of the specs when I originally purchased it, and like a lot of cheaper functional swords out there, it turned out way too blade heavy. And I'm talking about like way too blade heavy. There must have been like this much more meat on this guy, and it felt more like a hammer or an axe rather than a sword, like a sharpened crowbar. Thankfully, I had a teacher I knew who worked at a school that I attended for a little while, where we trained in multiple types of cultural weapons and styles. And thankfully he had experience in not only making weapons, but modifying them as well. In fact, me and him made a lot of both wooden and sometimes on rare occasion, I helped work with steel. He actually offered for free to help make this weapon a bit more manageable to wield, and what came out of his shop one day was a falchion. At first I didn't really find myself using it very often. I've treated it more like a collector's piece, but in time, every chance I gave it, I kind of started to fall in love with it a little more and more. It was only until recently I actually started using it for backyard cutting purposes, and that was mostly because of the construction issues with this blade. I noticed some other issues that involved the handle pieces always coming apart and loosening up. It has a beautiful rigid thick tang, almost as wide as these fullers here. Beautiful shoulders, no grinding or gouged pieces out of it like you find in most cheap weapons. The one issue I had is that there was way too much room in this hilt, and this pommel, despite being a wheel pommel, was not peened, so it would always hit against the wrist and start turning. And even at its tightest, it was always at a diagonal angle. I didn't really like that. So I did something a little regrettable and epoxied the whole dang thing together. And I mean, I loaded it up. I epoxied as much as I could, jammed all this on, and I tightened this as much as I could. I was almost afraid I was gonna, break the threading on this thing, but thankfully everything's now aligned and solid and confident. It has become one mean cutting machine. Alright. Yeah, that's a good sword. I know a lot of different falchions came in a lot of weird, crazy shapes and sizes, but I was a little curious if this was considered accurate. I had my doubts at first, but after doing some research, I found that it wasn't that off from some types. Rare examples of types, but there were some. James G. Elmsley had created a typography for single-edged medieval weapons, and again, this isn't single-edged because it was originally a double-edged arming sword. I discovered that this sword's tip style somewhat resembles, although historical examples are very rare, it's known as a type 1D or 2. Shadiveristy actually speaks about these types in detail in some of his videos. I'll link, I'll put a link in the description so you can check them out. They're really good. And he also created this nice visual chart for the said examples. As far as I can tell, although it's not really all that accurate towards the ones that were found, it's not far off from a 1D or 2. Typically, these types of falchions had a more pronounced point, much longer than my current example, that allowed for really powerful, precise thrusting. Mine isn't quite on the same scale or shape, but it does just as well. I have run a couple tests with wielding it both in this direction and this direction, and like you can see here, it does pretty well against water bottles. I unfortunately don't have any examples of abusive tests on video, such as hacking into wood or thrusting, but yeah, I guarantee you this does just fine. StrongBlade's products, although like Topeka, don't really have any distal tapering, or it's pretty thick all throughout, and even when it had the tip, that's probably why it was so dang heavy. But the temper is really nice. It came blunt at first, but when my teacher helped me reprofile the edge and get a nice sharpness on there, it was it's held. I've never had to resharpen it for anything after any abusive test cutting or anything like that. It's held, and although it's thick and rigid, it does still show flex when stressed. And I can't really show you a good example here, but I have done tests where I've stabbed it into a wood block and moved it around. It always does return to true, so good on this company for doing that. If you want to check their weapons out, I'll post a link in the description so you can take a look at them. I don't know if they've improved over time. This one in particular, before I had it lopped off, was known as the Dominus Knight Crusader arming sword, so if you want to take a look at it, go ahead. I still highly suggest them if you're looking for good budgetable weapons, but just be wary that, they're a tad heavy, and they might have a bit of handling issues from time to time, but other than that, they're pretty fine. Mine currently, I don't know the specs it had before I made the modifications. It's about 2.8, 2.9 pounds, so not completely unheard of or horrible. The point of balance is about 3 inches from the guard. Again, that's much more manageable than it was before. I'd say I'd rather have it here than all the way like up here. Overall length from pommel to the tip is about 30 inches, and the blade itself is 22.5. It's manageable now. And although it feels heavy and choppy, that I don't believe that was unheard of for historical examples. It feels so much more appropriate. I can actually cut with this thing and swing it without it destroying my wrist. You can see a bit of discoloration, some blues, purples, golds. I'm not really sure how well the camera is picking it up. And although it's pretty looking, some people told me that that's a sign of the steel losing its temper. But after doing some abusive testing, it's still held an edge, and nothing's wrong with the tip at all. So, seems to be working fine for me. And I kind of find it a little pretty, so I didn't grind it off or anything. It's kind of nice. This part where he had cut off isn't sharp. It's still got that thick, you can probably see it here, it's still really thick, but he gave it a nice bevel, so aesthetically it's still pleasing. I just have to, if I want to cut with this side as the primary cutting edge, I really have to close the distance. Otherwise, by the time this part clips into the target, it's going to stop cutting. Either way, if you're if you're using that as for self-defense and you still manage to hit the person with that part, that's still going to do damage. If it doesn't cut, it's going to bludgeon, it's going to break bones. This thing is mean looking and it bites, and where it doesn't bite, it just bludgeons. So again, it feels confident and still looks very, very pretty. Overall, I'm very pleased with this weapon. And I even went ahead recently and fixed the sheath, so it's not like the best work that I've done, but it now fits the blade appropriately. And what I really like about StrongBlade's products as compared to some windlasses and things like that, this stud here is really helpful for putting it into like a sword belt. Hangs really nice, and I've never had problems with it coming loose before, so this sheath is really nice. Hardwood under this leather and everything. As for the review, that's about all I have to say about this sword. It's simple, a little weird, but I absolutely love it. It's fun, it's beautiful, and after some modification, it's quite functional. If you want to see some cutting demonstrations using this weapon, go ahead and stick around for the end of this video. So I'm just going to be doing a couple quick cuts on some water bottles, because unfortunately at the moment I don't have anything like tatami mats, so bit windy.
bites. Very nice.